The eviction notice was taped to the door of the rusted trailer, flapping violently in the biting Montana wind. It was the only birthday present Ethan received for turning 14. Beside him, 7-year-old Lily clutched her worn-out stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide with a question she was too scared to ask. Where do we go now? In the town of Ironwood Creek, poverty wasn't treated as a tragedy, it was treated as a nuisance. When their parents died in a pileup on the interstate 6 months ago, they left behind nothing but a mountain of medical bills and a deed to 20 acres of land, known locally as the Boneyard. The Boneyard was a jagged scar of limestone on the edge of town, useless for farming, impossible for ranching, and, according to Mayor Sterling, fit only for rattlesnakes and fools. "You can't eat rocks, son," Sterling had sneered at the local diner earlier that week, his voice loud enough for the Saturday morning crowd to chuckle over their coffee and pancakes. "That land is a burden. Hand the deed over to the county for tax relief and go find a foster home in the city." But Ethan knew what foster care meant. It meant being split up. It meant losing the only family he had left. "We aren't going anywhere," Ethan whispered, grabbing their 2 canvas duffel bags. With their entire lives packed on their backs, Ethan led Lily away from the paved roads and up the steep deer trails toward the limestone ridges. The wind here was brutal, a nor'easter that cut through their thin thrift store jackets like a knife. But as they scrambled over the gray rocks, they reached it. The dark, yawning mouth of a limestone cavern his dad used to tell bedtime stories about. To the town, it was just a hole in the ground. But as Ethan pulled Lily across the threshold, the roaring wind instantly vanished. He placed his hand on the cave wall. It wasn't freezing like the air outside. It was cool, dry, and solid. "Ethan?" Lily whispered, shivering. "It's dark. I'm scared." "It's not just dark, Lil," Ethan said, his voice finding a grit he didn't know he possessed. He struck a match, lighting the old kerosene lantern he'd salvaged from the trailer. The soft, golden light danced on the ancient stone walls, revealing a natural fortress that no bank could foreclose on. He looked at his little sister, his face illuminated by the flickering flame. "It's a castle, and the best part? It's ours." While Ironwood Creek prepared for winter by buying expensive propane heaters and reinforcing their wooden frames, 2 orphans disappeared into the earth, betting their lives on a gamble that everyone else called madness. The construction of the Rat Cave, as the locals at the Ironwood Creek Saloon christened it, wasn't a project of vanity, it was an act of desperate ingenuity. Ethan didn't have a line of credit at the local hardware store, and he certainly couldn't afford fresh lumber. Instead, he became a master of the scavenge. While other boys his age were playing video games or baseball, Ethan was dumpster diving behind construction sites, dragging home-warped 2X4s, discarded shipping pallets, and sheets of plywood that contractors had deemed trash. To the people watching from the highway below, it looked like a pile of junk being dragged into a black hole. But inside the cavern, Ethan was building a fortress. He leveled the cave floor, clearing away loose rocks to create a flat foundation. Using the mismatched lumber, he framed a small, boxy cabin about 20 feet inside the cave's mouth. It wasn't pretty, a patchwork quilt of wood and tarps, but it was solid. He sealed the gaps with river clay and moss, insulating their small room against drafts. He even rigged a stovepipe to vent smoke through a natural fissure in the limestone ceiling, a trick he'd read about in an old survivalist book at the public library. "Look at him," Mayor Sterling chuckled one afternoon, idling his pristine Ford pickup truck on the service road. He rolled down the window as Ethan hauled a heavy, discarded window frame up the trail. "You planning to open a zoo exhibit up there, kid? Or just digging your own grave?" The passengers in the truck laughed, a cruel, jagged sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "It's called insulation, Mr. Mayor," Ethan muttered under his breath, not stopping. The town had already started a betting pool at the barbershop. How long until the orphans freeze or come crawling back to social services? They called Ethan crazy, primitive, and stubborn. But Ethan understood something the townspeople, with their expensive HVAC systems and vinyl siding, had forgotten. He knew that the cave was a massive thermal battery. While the temperature outside swung from blistering 90s in July to freezing in October, the air inside the cave held steady at a constant, mild 55 degrees. His shack didn't need to fight the wind or the snow. The mountain was doing the heavy lifting. The cabin was just a blanket. The cave was the house. By late October, the structure was complete. It sat inside the massive stone chamber like a secret, protected by millions of years of geology. "Is it ready?" Lily asked one evening, holding up a battery-powered lantern. Ethan looked at their patchwork home. It was ugly, strange, and mocked by everyone they knew. But as he closed the front door, the silence was absolute. No wind, no ridicule, just safety. "Yeah, Lil," he smiled, exhausted but proud. "It's ready, let them laugh." But the laughter was about to die out. The gray clouds gathering over the northern peaks weren't bringing a normal winter storm. They were bringing a monster. November in Ironwood Creek usually meant the smell of wood smoke and the bustle of folks preparing for Thanksgiving. But this year, the air felt different. It felt electric, heavy, and wrong. While the townspeople below were busy hanging plastic Santa Claus decorations on the lampposts and arguing over the last turkeys at the grocery store, Ethan was watching the world go quiet. He noticed things the adults missed. The crows and magpies, usually noisy scavengers around the dumpsters, had vanished completely. The deer had moved down from the high ridges days ago, disappearing into the deep timber. Inside the rat cave, Ethan checked an old, cracked barometer he had found at a yard sale. The needle wasn't just falling, it was plummeting. "What does that mean?" Lily asked, tracing the glass dial with a small finger. "It means something big is coming," Ethan said, his voice tight. "Bigger than a snow day." Driven by a gut instinct that screamed survival, Ethan went into overdrive. While the town relied on the power grid and propane delivery trucks, Ethan turned to the cave. He spent days dragging deadfall timber into the cavern, stacking cords of firewood in the bone-dry alcoves where no snow could ever reach. He checked their water source, a crystal-clear spring that flowed from the deep limestone recesses, unfrozen and constant. Down in the valley, the mood was dismissively cheerful. "Just a bit of powder for the skiers," Mayor Sterling declared at the gas station, filling up his truck. He laughed off the Weather Service's warnings, trusting his modern insulated siding and central heating. After all, this was the 21st century. Weather was an inconvenience, not a threat. But by late afternoon on Tuesday, the sky turned a terrifying shade of purple and gray, the color of old bruises. The wind didn't just blow, it began to inhale, sucking the warmth right out of the valley. Ethan stood at the mouth of the cave, watching the dark wall of clouds consume the horizon. He pulled Lily back from the entrance and bolted the heavy wooden door he had built. "Don't be scared," he told her, lighting the oil lamp as the daylight was snuffed out hours too early. "We have food. We have wood. We have the rock." The town had credit cards and electricity. Ethan had physics and stone. And as the first scream of the wind tore through the canyon, the time for preparation was over. The monster had arrived. The blizzard didn't just arrive, it assaulted the world. It hit with a fury that turned the landscape white in seconds, dropping visibility to less than arm's length. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero, and the wind screamed through the canyon at 60 miles per hour, sounding less like weather and more like a dying animal. Down in Ironwood Creek, the illusion of safety shattered within the first hour. The power grid, which everyone relied on, failed immediately under the weight of the ice. Without electricity, the modern furnaces in the town's expensive homes became useless metal boxes. Panic set in. The Cooper family, who had laughed at Ethan's dirt floor, found their chimney blocked by snow-driven wind, forcing smoke back into their living room and driving them into a freezing back bedroom, huddled under every blanket they owned. The town's historic church, built to withstand a century of storms, had its windows blown out by the sheer force of the gusts. But the worst fate befell Mayor Sterling. The man who had mocked the cave as a whole watched in horror as the wind caught a loose shingle on his roof. In a matter of seconds, it peeled back half the structure like a sheet of paper, exposing his home to the lethal cold. The town was freezing, terrified, and helpless against the relentless white chaos. Yet less than a mile away, inside the limestone ridge, the scene was surreal in its calmness. Ethan sat on a rug scavenged from a dumpster, dealing a hand of go fish to Lily. Outside the cave entrance, the storm roared like a freight train, a constant, deafening reminder of the violence just 20 feet away. But inside the chamber, the wind couldn't reach. The thermal mass of the mountain held the temperature steady. The small wood stove crackled efficiently, its heat lingering in the dry air, rather than being sucked out by drafts. They didn't have electricity, but they had oil lamps that cast a warm, golden glow against the ancient stone walls. "It's loud out there," Lily whispered, playing a card. "I know," Ethan replied, checking a pot of soup simmering on the stove. "But the mountain is holding us. It's been here for thousands of years. It's not going anywhere." For 5 days, the storm raged without mercy. On the third day, Ethan walked to the end of their entrance tunnel. He stood in the protected buffer zone and looked out at the white void. He was watching the apocalypse from the safety of a sanctuary, safe and warm while the civilized world below fell apart. The rat cave wasn't a trap. It was the only lifeboat in a sea of ice. On the morning of the sixth day, the screaming wind finally died. The silence that followed was louder than the storm itself. Ethan unbolted the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. The world outside had been erased. In its place was a blinding, pristine, white ocean of snow that sparkled under a cold, indifferent sun. The rat cave had held. The temperature inside hadn't dropped a single degree. "Stay close, Lil," Ethan said, strapping on a pair of makeshift snowshoes he'd fashioned from bent willow branches and paracord. They made their way down the buried trail toward Ironwood Creek. What they found wasn't a town. It was a disaster zone. The weight of the snow had crushed the gas station's canopy. Power lines lay snaking across the drifts like dead black vines. The silence was broken only by the sound of sirens wailing in the distance, struggling to navigate the impassable roads. Near the town square, they found Mayor Sterling. The man who had once stood tall in his tailored suit was now wrapped in 3 wool blankets, his face gray and haggard, shoveling snow away from a front door that was blocked by a 6-foot drift. His grand Victorian house stood dark and lifeless, its windows boarded up, its expensive furnace silent. When Sterling looked up and saw the 2 orphans standing there, rosy-cheeked, well-fed, and calm, he dropped his shovel. He stared at them as if he were seeing ghosts. "You," Sterling stammered, his breath puffing in the freezing air. We thought you were dead. We thought the cave would become a tomb." "The cave is 55 degrees, Mr. Mayor," Ethan said softly. There was no malice in his voice, only a quiet, resilient strength. "We have dry wood, fresh water, and plenty of space. It's warm." Sterling looked at his shivering neighbors, at the children crying in the freezing church hall nearby. The arrogance that had defined the town vanished, replaced by a desperate, humble realization. "Can," Sterling swallowed his pride, his voice trembling, "can it hold more people?" "It's not a palace," Ethan replied, looking back up at the limestone ridge. "But it's safe. Bring the kids. Bring the elderly. We have room." That night, the rat cave didn't house rats. It housed the very people who had mocked it. The town's wealthiest families sat on log stumps and scavenged rugs, warming their hands by Ethan's stove, grateful for the shelter provided by the boy they had tried to evict. In the years that followed, Ironwood Creek rebuilt, but it was never the same. The mockery stopped. The cave remained, not as a symbol of poverty, but as a monument to ingenuity. A small plaque was eventually placed near the entrance, not by the city council, but by the people. It didn't list a date or a name. It simply read, "In the cold, the stone was warmer than gold." Question for the audience. If you were in Ethan's shoes, would you have opened the door to the people who mocked you, or would you have kept your sanctuary to yourself? Let me know your honest answer in the comments below. I read every single one. Call to action. If this story warmed your heart, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We bring you powerful stories of survival and humanity every week. Don't miss the next one.